Hello, I'm SB Moores, and today I wanted to make a video regarding the final epigraph of the epilogue of The Bonehunters, the sixth book in the Laseen Book of the Fallen series by Steven Erikson. This is going to be full spoilers up until the end of the Bonehunters, so if you read the Bonehunters, you can watch this video, and obviously everything before. No spoilers for anything beyond this, Reaper's Gale, all that. No spoilers for that. So if you've just read the Bone Hunters, you can watch this video. But in specific, it is the epigraph poem I'm talking is a poem by Fisher, which is Fisher Keltath. Although here it just says Fisher. Um and I think to kick it off, I'm going to start as I've done every other one of these and do a quick little reading of it, just so you can remember if you don't want to pull out your own book or ebook or whatever. But here goes. In a journey through the wastes, I found a god, kneeling as it pushed its hands into the sand again and again, each time lifting them up to watch the lifeless grain stream down. Dismounting from my weary horse, I walked to stand before this apparition in its dusty hands, and watched for a time the cycles of their motion, when at last up it looked, eyes beseeching. Where, asked this god, are my children? The lost believers. Fisher. So I read that in that particular way. Most of it I tried to read monotone, because there's no real inclination to the feeling, at least in my opinion, of how Fisher, who I'm assuming is the one dismounting from his horse since it says I, um, it doesn't, of course, it could be someone else saying I, but I take it to be Fisher. And in this particular moment, uh, Fisher himself doesn't seem to have any particular emotion regarding this event. So that's why I read it that way, except for those final lines, or that final line, just the last one, where the god speaks that the poem refers to. And he says, where are my children? In the reading, I read that with that more sad, almost like confused, distraught tone, is because it says, before that, eyes beseeching, which to me indicates that this god is not happy and he's really looking to understand why, like what is happening. Um, so to go off immediately, the imagery that is presented during the first stanza, how it mentions that they're in a wasteland with countless grains of sand around them, immediately makes you think of Seven Cities. So that immediately ties it to a location in the series, and the Bone Hunters mostly takes place on Seven Cities, but it also takes place on Malaz City. But I'll get to that. But mostly it takes place on Seven Cities. So for this to talk about a wasteland is very apt, in my opinion, for the imagery, tonally wise, especially for what the poem is about. And the reason that I chose to read this poem a little closer is because it is the final poem of the Bone Hunters. And I've said this before, but I feel like the final epigraph of these books usually in some way encapsulates a big aspect of the books. And in specific, there are two connections that I was able to very specifically make, and then one very minor connection. I even wrote them down, all those. But 'cause I tried to record this before and it didn't go so well. Without that note. But in specific, I feel like to fully understand this poem and who it's referring to, you have to move back a page instead of going to the next one. And if you remember, the final chapter ends with Cotillion, and Trolsengar and Onrak, near and Quitben, and Shadow Throne and Alrada An is mentioned. Um, Although it's just his body at this point, sadly. But it's mostly about Cotillion to me, is what this poem's about. So I'm going to focus on this final page where Cotillion is mentioned and how this poem relates to him and how this poem relates to the book as a whole. Um, in specific, this is right after they defend the first throne or the throne of shadow. I forget which. I'm pretty sure the throne of shadow is on Drift of Volley. So I want to say that this is the first throne because we know this isn't Driftivali. Shadow Throne was able to protect that in a strange way, but it worked out quite well, and it was quite sneaky, and it made sense for it being the Throne of Shadow and Shadow Throne defending it the way that he did. But um, they're defending the first throne, and the defenders of the first throne, even though Cotillion is there and Quickben is summoned to deal with Akarium, and there's also obviously Troll Sengar and Onrak, the main defending force are children, the same children that Panek helped, refugees from the whirlwind that are that were adopted by the woman that Kalam Mekhar ended up having a slight relationship, or not a slight. He had a relationship with come the end of Dead House Gates that kind of broke apart by the end of or by the beginning of House of Chains, sadly, because of just some personal struggles with them. I'm trying to remember her name. It is kind of difficult to remember her name. She was not spoken of very often. I don't even think she's listed in the Dramatis Personae, so I really don't remember her name. I thought it was Marilta for a second, but I'm pretty sure she is one of the staff of the Phoenix Inn in Dargistan, so definitely not her. But in any case, she has adopted all these children and with Panek, and they're very young. I mean, they're children. They're around like 10 to 14 years old, I think. 14, I think 16 is like the oldest that any of them might be, but even that might be too old. And Cotillion and Shadowthrone have them defending the first throne, which immediately probably puts a distaste in anybody's mouth because they're using children as fighters. And when there's fighting going on, especially against the Editor or anybody, there's going to be people dying. And quite a bit of the children die during this scene. And that's really one of the first parallels that I have with this poem and Cotillion. Um, because immediately you might have the idea that Cotillion is an extraordinarily bad individual for having used these children. And while that arguably is not up for debate, you know, he's using children to defend the first throne, he obviously does not want to, and he obviously doesn't take any pride or joy or solace in the fact that he has to do this. This really becomes apparent towards these final lines when Troll Sengar tells him that he's not going to fight anymore, and he says, nor Onrak, nor these children. Cotillion, please. And then Cotillion turns away from him and says, of course not, Troll Sengar. And then the final paragraph is Troll Sengar looking at him, and he says, he stepped to the entranceway, looked out, and saw Cotillion, patron of assassins, the god, sitting on a shelf of stone that had slipped down from one wall, sitting alone, with his head in his hands. So obviously he's not happy about that. Cotillion, though he did it, and which is terrible, that he used these children, it very much shows that he did not want to do this. He did not want to have to rely and let children die in order to defend the first throne. And this poem, as well as Cotillion, show a lot about him. This is probably the most characterization Cotillion's gotten throughout the series. In this book in particular, I feel like he gains a lot, as well as towards the end of House of Chains with his interactions with Apsalar, or not Apsalar, she's called in this book. But um, in specific, I believe the reason that I immediately made this parallel between these two characters is because the Lost Believers, if you want to take it at face value, it is the poem of a god that has all of its worshippers have been destroyed, or they've lost faith, or they've died in some way. And though we don't know what has caused this, the grains of sand representing the innumerable amount of them, combined with the god constantly, you know, pulling the sand up and watching it drip through his fingers and fall away, and then looking, eyes beseeching, asking, where are my children? And then the poem is called The Lost Believers. It just immediately make you think, oh, well, by children he meant his believers, and he's wondering where they went. They died. It's quite sad. This god does not know where his followers have gone. What happened to them? Did they die? Did they go away somehow? Like get lost? Did they stop worshiping him? We don't know. We don't know. That's not spoken about. But I actually just immediately thought of a new parallel that I haven't even thought of. So I'm just gonna really quickly add that to the list. But immediately the parallels that happen to me are the fact that the god calls them children instead of believers, but the poem is called Lost Believers. It's kind of, I don't know if this would be right, but a double entendre because there is, but maybe it's not because it's not one line. That's the double entendre. It's given new meaning with the name of the poem. Because the name of the poem gives you the meaning that, oh, this is about a god losing his worshippers, whereas the poem itself makes you think, even though you could come to the conclusion that the god's talking about his children, because that imagery would make a lot of sense, a god's worshippers are his children. I also drew the parallel that it could be talking literally, and it's supposed to be referencing what happened with Cotillion in the sense that his the children that he was kind of protecting, he used, and they died for it. And the word beseeching also gives that more sad tone to it, that distraught tone to it, that Cotillion definitely portrayed at the very end when final thing he does in this book is sit alone by himself and put his hands or his head in his hands, probably thinking to himself, "Oh my God, what have I done? Why has this happened?" Even though he's the one who caused it. And that could give a new layer of meaning to the poem as well. That because we're not given the exact idea of what happened to these believers, but you could come to the conclusion that since it's the God standing among all these grains, that he's the one who has caused this to happen. Almost a madness, insanity. Um, but I immediately drew those connections between Cotillion and this poem, what with children and being sad, and even Cotillion putting his head in his hands. I'd imagine, he's got his hands cupped like this. I would immediately, when I think of that, it's kind of similar to like scooping your hands into sand and pulling them up like this, almost to your face, almost covering your face. So all of that imagery as well as the themes of the poem really connect with Cotillion, and I really feel like that's front and foremost, especially since it comes right after these. That is what this poem is supposed to be making you think of thematically. Is it's extra character building almost for Cotillion. It's a poem about Cotillion's plight, even if he's the one who's caused it. Um, as well as this is another imagery I could think of is you have to think of the fact that um there being in a wasteland in the poem, and the wasteland is, excuse me, wasteland is probably made up of all these particulates of sand. It immediately makes, or to me, I immediately thought, well, that's got to be like Um, that's not literal. There can't be that many worshippers. There was no. I mean, there's more grains of sand than there are people alive in deserts. I would imagine on beaches. Um, but what is interesting is that beyond this, I drew the idea that potentially it's trying to show that the children or the worshippers meant much more to the god that is than what their literal amount was. That the depth of the pain he feels for the fact that all these children are dead and all these gods are dead is as vast as a wasteland, not just however many actually died. That's what I immediately drew. It took me a second to get those thoughts together, but that's uh, kind of the idea that I had. This might not be something that was intended, but it's something that I definitely was thinking about when I reread this poem. Um, I felt as if there might have been a passing connection between this poem and Polio and her death because I don't think she has many worshippers after that, but I couldn't really come to a complete consensus on that, so I'm just going to leave it at that. There might be a connection between Polio and this because, Polio's a god and she dies. But not too sure about that. But one of the connections that I thought about a little more that was definitely removed more from this god idea was Laseen and the Bonehunters and the Malazan Empire. because in a very odd, extrapolated, symbolical way, Laseen is a god, and the Bone Hunters are her worshippers because they are the soldiers of the Malazan Empire. And even though there's a lot more meaning to that, it's are the Bone Hunters fighting for Laseen, or are they fighting for themselves and for the Empire and the people of the Empire? Um, when they return home to Malaz City and then everything goes down, they find that Laseen's kind of been stuck in this pincer attack between you got Corbolo Dom lording over one side and Malik Rel being a slimy bastard on the other. Um, you have to think to yourself, or at least to me, I immediately drew the connection of how she kind of threw the Bone Hunters under the bus and threw them away, and basically was of the had to take the course of action of being like, we're just gonna have to let the people kill the Wiccans. I mean, it's what happens. I'm not gonna try and quell these riots. It's just sort of what has to happen for the Empire. Basically saying, I know that you guys did all this for me, and Coltaine was legendary, but this is the year of 10,000 lies. She didn't actually say that, but this is the year of 10,000 lies. The people are not happy. They need their blood. We're gonna let them kill the Wiccans. I'm sorry. I know they're a big part of the Bone Hunters, but it simply cannot happen. And in doing that, she drives the Bone Hunters away. They have to leave. Uh, and this is where the word beseeching kind of really does have a double entendre to me. Um, is that a lot of the argument that Laseen has after these scenes trying to get back to the boats with their little romp through the city with Tamber or to Amber and I can't Clam is was the Empress signaling to her that she wants help, that she should forge back into that room and try and kill Malik Rel and Corbolo Dom to free the Empress, to fix the corruption in the Empire. Maybe that she is offering the adjunct a seat at their place instead of ruling the Empire. And that's where I immediately thought of the word beseeching because to me, that is the idea of Laseen beseeching, begging to the Bone Hunters, please save me. I don't want to actually do this to you, but I don't know. But this is a very big point of contention, I'd argue, because there's a lot of people that don't understand why Laseen did all the things that she did here, and it was just speculation on the part of Tavor that that is what Laseen wanted her to do. So we don't actually know. I feel like that is probably something that's dealt with in novels of the Latin Empire, but I'm not quite certain. Maybe it's just left at that. But um, going along with that, the idea of lost believers and sand trickling through fingers and where have my children gone? Bone hunters leave. They. If this idea that Laseen really did want this help and the bone hunters just left, it really gives that idea of like, where have you gone? I needed you. So that's definitely some extra meaning and parallel that I was able to pull out of the poem in regards to Laseen. I don't know if that was the exact intention, but that's definitely what I drew. And then the final sort of connection that I was able to draw, although it's not as concrete because we don't know what the god themselves were thinking, is something to do with Direk, the Worm of Autumn. Because one of the big mysteries throughout this book is what has happened to all the priests of Direk. You know, the prologue is about them dying in Kartul City, and then I believe Cutter and gang end up finding a group of dead direct priests inside of a random temple in seven cities. So she is a very widespread god. She's worshipped throughout the world, probably Huantali, seven cities, Falar, Genabacchus, and I'd imagine maybe even Corelry, some other continents. A sail, maybe, I don't know. Maybe not. From what I've gathered, a sail's not too much is known, or it's really bad whatever's happening there, based off of some stuff in Memories of Ice. But um, Direct, as we find out at the end, kills all of her worshippers because every one of her worshippers, it seems, except for Banishtar, who was excommunicated, had flipped, and they were betraying Direct and moving towards the cult of the crippled god to aid him instead. And so she smites them all. She kills them all for this transgression they did. And I believe that this poem could be very apt description of this particular plot point because Direct has lost all of her followers, it seems. And that is probably as close you could get to where are my children? Where have they gone? Why have they done this? And that also comes back to that idea that I had that maybe this also parallel to Cotillion is that maybe the fact that he's within the grains pulling them up shows that he's the one who's done it, who has caused this to happen. And Direct, though she seemingly had no choice, is the one who had to smite all of her worshippers. So that is kind of a parallel imagery that I had with that specific plot line and this poem. But for the poem as a whole, I feel like it was a very apt way of wrapping up certain ideas in this book, and I believe that it kind of has a double meaning, or not a double meaning, that it's a good yin and yang of the plot lines with the epilogue itself, because I believe the epilogue was able to capture the whole a lot of the actual events and themes in this book on one half with all of the traps and whatnot, and the idea of all these lies being spread. Whereas this was able to really go in depth with certain other events, like I said, Laseen, Cotillion at the very end, Direct and what she has done and her followers have done, as well as possibly Poliel's death. Like I said, I'm still not too sure on that one. But those are all of the connections that I was able to draw out of this poem. I think it's a very good poem, and I think it's a very good way of ending the book as being the final epigraph for the epilogue. I feel like it did a very good job wrapping up those specific themes and ideas that were and plot points that were presented throughout the novel, especially making you think about them a little more about all that has happened throughout this book. But that's just my little analysis, little discussion with you guys on what the Lost Believers is about and its relationship to the text of the Bone Hunters. Um, I don't know if that was my best analysis, but I really did enjoy reading the poem again and thinking about what it meant for the larger story of the book. Another note that I've had is that I've been thinking about it, and Steven Erikson is so good at creating poems and epigraphs and story beats and just lines in these books that gain so much more meaning and parallels and have more connections the further along you go, even beyond the book that they appear in. And I believe that this might be one of them, but I'm not completely sure what connections I could immediately draw. As with a series as large as this, it'd be difficult not to. But at the same time, the way that he does it is so masterful, in my opinion. It's one of the reasons I enjoy this series so much. But because of this, I've been thinking that maybe a lot of the poems that I've done analyses on and read, maybe I need to go back once I'm finished the series and reread a lot of them because maybe they'll gain much more meaning at that point. I know everybody says that you don't really understand the Malazan Book of the Fallen until your second, third, fourth, fifth reread. But I am not quite that fast at reading, and I also have an entire monolith of books in my room waiting to get chugged through. And I've read 40 total, and I probably have close to 400, so I'm doing pretty bad on that end. I'm also a collector, I guess, so I don't mind too much. But that is all I had to say about the Lost Believers and the Bone Hunters. I hope that you enjoyed the video. I hope that maybe this made you look at the poem a little closer. Maybe you'll go back and read it and think about it, or think about the Bone Hunters in general, because it's a great, great book, both in terms of action as well as the themes and um, it's definitely worth some analysis. But I hope that you enjoyed the video, and I hope that you have a good day.